What is up, harvesters? Welcome back to the returning viewers. And if you're brand new here, welcome to Hobby Harvest. My name is Ken. So if you guys are trying to figure out how to get those food plots up and running this coming season, you've come to the right place. We are going to go over in detail how to get those food plots established this year. So we're going to start as if you have never put in a food plot before, but if you do have food plots in, you can still use these tips. And as we get past the first tip of setting up the location, everything's going to apply to every food plot that's out there for this season. So make sure you guys are doing these things to have successful food plots this season. So the first thing that you need to worry about if you don't have a food plot in yet is the site selection. So you may have a site in mind already, but let's just make sure that it is going to do the things that we need it to do. So first off, we need this food location to be in an area that is going to benefit the rest of our property. Now, typically, wherever we put the food location, everything else, all the other habitat improvements, those are going to be dependent on where the food is anyway. So really, it doesn't matter where your food plots go because you're going to build everything else off away from them. Your bedding areas, your man-made deer trails, those man-made funnels where you force the deer to move through. But we do kind of want to have a bigger overall plan in mind so that we're not putting a food plot in a bad location for later. And usually that just means that we don't want to put our food plot in the back, far back corner of our property that's the furthest from any place we can access the property for a couple reasons, but mostly because we want to keep those deep, dark back parts of our property secure for bedding areas later. You want your food plots to typically be more in the middle of your property or near your access points so that you can get in and out of them for maintaining them, but also for hunting them or hunting the movement going in and out of them. So you don't usually want these to be like visible from the road, so you do want them back a little ways off of wherever you're accessing in. You're going to want them to be tight and secure so that the deer will feel safe going into them. But just make sure you're keeping some other areas off in the corners of your property or that deep, dark back swamp hole or whatever back in there safe and untouched for all of those bucks and whatever to bed down in there, and then they can come out and come to these food sources. Now, the other thing is going to be specific to the site. You do typically want to have a food plot that is somewhat level. Now, if you don't have any level ground, you're trying to do this on a hill, you can do that as well. You're just going to have to worry more about erosion in those cases, which means you're going to want something always growing in your food plot. And we'll get into that later when we talk about how we're going to do food plots without using chemicals, and the way we do that is to keep something always growing in them. So just keep that in mind when we get to that later. Now, again, like I said earlier, is we want to make sure that we can hunt the lines of movement coming in and out of this food source. So don't like pinch this up against a property line or put it where you can't hunt the lines of movement getting in and out of it. I do 100% recommend hunting the trail going into the food plot over hunting the actual food plot itself. So make sure you can get into wherever that is, however that's going to relate to the rest of your property. You don't want to like pinch this up against your neighbor's property and your neighbor can just sit right across the fence and hunt your food plot. And of course, we want to make sure that we can also access these with equipment. Now, even if you're like, hey, I'm not going to access this with a four-wheeler, I don't even have a four-wheeler, just keep in mind that you're going to be carrying hundreds of pounds of seed, of fertilizer, of lime into these food plots over the lifetime of the food plot. So you're not going to want this to be an area that is a bear to access. You're going to want this to be somewhere that is somewhat easily accessed, somewhere that maybe you have a trail or a road that you can pull a four-wheeler up to, or your truck right up in there. Whatever, just make sure that you're not burying these back in some deep dark hole that you can barely get into on foot, because you are going to have to maintain these over the years. So all right, now that we've decided on an area of the woods, the thing that we need to talk about next is prepping that site. So the biggest thing you guys are going to need to worry about is getting sunlight down into these food plots. The number one thing that food plots need is sunlight. Yes, they also need rain and they also need good soil. Those are the three things they need. But if you don't get them good sunlight, it doesn't matter if you have great rain and great soil, they're just not going to grow. So if you have high canopy trees, yep, chainsaw time. You got to get out there. You got to drop those high canopy trees. While you're standing on the food plot, look to the south if you're in the northern hemisphere and look at all of those big high canopy trees that are going to be casting shade down onto your food plot. You're going to need to get that canopy out of there, and you're going to need to get sunlight beaming down onto your food plot for as many hours of the day as possible. Now, while we're clearing the area for where the food plot itself is actually going to go, we need to keep in mind the shape of the food plot. Now, I know when you guys look online, most of the food plots you guys see are big circles, big ovals, big rectangles. I do not recommend making a food plot that shape, and I'll tell you the reasons why. So I will almost always put my food plots in the shape of like an L or a boomerang, or in some shape where if deer are on this side of the food plot, they cannot see the deer on this side of the food plot. So if it comes out in an L, there's going to be that barrier in the middle where they can't see each other through. The reason for this is bucks, when they're cruising during the rut, are going to be looking for does. And if all they have to do is stand 50 yards off in the woods, look out onto your food plot, and they can see the entire food plot, there's no reason for them to come out onto the food plot if there's no does out there. Now, if you thicken up the area around your food plot, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, and then also have that middle barrier, visual barrier between one half of your food plot and the other, you will get those bucks to come out into the open on that food plot. And if you are hunting that food plot, if hunting on it, he's going to be right in front of you where you can have a shot on him. And that, of course, is where I would put that stand, is at that pinch point in the middle of that boomerang shape. Now, the other side of this is that if that buck came out over here, but you're hunting the trail that comes in and out over here, you want him to come all the way through and come past you. You don't want him to stand off over here, take a look in, and turn around and go back the other way when you're sitting over here. So having that food plot in the shape of an L or a boomerang or whatever is going to force him to move through the food plot. And I have had so much success with this. I sit and watch young bucks do this all the time. I sit and watch the old bucks make it right in front of me before I take my shot at them. And it's just such a perfect way to influence deer movement by something as simple as not making a big circle, rectangle, oval food plot. Make the deer move through your food plot. So next, we're going to talk about thickening up the outsides of your food plot. So you want to screen the outside of your food plot, and the reason being is when the deer are out on the food plot with their head down, grazing, they want to feel safe and secure. They don't want to be constantly looking up and checking to see what's looking at them from any part of the woods hundreds of yards away. They want to feel safe and secure, just like a pheasant will hide in the thickest area of the brush, or a rabbit will hide in the biggest thickets. A deer too wants cover around them, especially when they're feeding, because they feel vulnerable because they have their head down to eat. So you want to thicken up the edges. We can do this with switchgrass. I have videos out there on how to establish switchgrass. That is going to take you guys a couple years to get those nice big stands that you guys see online on some other guys' food plots. But you want to do whatever you can to thicken up the edge. Just chopping it down or brush hogging it. While you're out there with the chainsaw, if you cut everything off and let that regenerative growth spring up on the edges of the food plot, that's going to really thicken up the edges of that food plot, especially if you're letting that sunlight come down in there. That's going to make all of that stuff under the big canopy around the edges of your food plot spring up and thicken up, and that's going to create that screen for you. Especially when we're talking about an L-shaped food plot, that middle area needs to be thickened up as well. I would almost go as far as to put up some sort of barrier in the middle of there during the first season before you get some of this regenerative growth coming up, to force them around the boomerang shape of the food plots. You could put up something like a snow fence in there, or just take all of your branches and brush. Typically when I clean out a food plot when I'm establishing it for the first time, that brush pile goes in the middle there. So it's easy because it's close from every point of the food plot to put it in the middle. And that also creates that visual barrier. And by the time that stuff decays and breaks down, I usually have the regenerative growth coming up. So great way to kill two birds with one stone there, to get rid of your debris and to create that visual barrier in the middle. Now the next thing we're going to talk about is soil prep. So first and foremost, when you're at this stage, get that soil test, send it in. You're going to need that before you seed. But in the soil prep stage now, I'm going to tell you guys how to do this with chemicals and without chemicals. So I know where we're at in our current climate here. I know the Make America Healthy Again movement is going to villainize glyphosate over the next several years, and there are reasons for that, especially when it's sprayed on food that we personally eat. I am going to tell you how to use glyphosate in this video on how to kill off your native grasses and other weeds in your plots before we ever even put seed on the ground. Now, what the Make America Healthy Again movement is worried about is they spray glyphosate on wheat right before they harvest it in order to get it to dry out and to get it to die off so that they can harvest that wheat head They then take that wheat head that was sprayed with glyphosate and they put it into our food supply. That is completely different than what we're doing in this scenario where we spray the ground, we kill off the grasses. Once they're dead, we then throw seed into that soil. Now, the half-life of glyphosate, once it touches soil, is instantaneous. So there is more microorganisms and bacteria in the soil that will completely destroy that glyphosate as soon as it touches it. So by the time you then plant your seed into the soil, that plant grows up, the deer eat it, the deer process it, we eat the deer. There is very, very little chance that any of it makes it through that whole stage as compared to them actually spraying glyphosate on your food and then you eating it. So I just want you guys to know the difference between what we're doing and what they're villainizing, and you guys make up the choice for yourself. I'm also going to teach you how to do this without using chemicals. Me personally, I usually will establish a brand new food plot with chemicals and then move to a completely chemical-free year after year rotation where I don't need to do that. And I'll get into more detail into this video of why you would benefit from doing that. But again, up to you guys. You do what is right for you and yours. So if we're going to use chemicals to start these food plots, once you've cleared everything out of there, the reason you're going to want to do this is you're going to have native grasses in there. Native grasses come back year after year, regardless of if they drop seed or not, because they come back out of that established root structure. So by spraying, you are going to kill off all of those native grasses, and they will not come back unless you disturb your soil. And we're doing this no-till, so we're not going to disturb our soil. So the advantage of using chemicals that first year, that first round, is you're going to wipe out those native grasses, and then we can get into a cover crop after cover crop rotation that will choke out and prevent any of these weeds from coming up. Now, rule number one of food plotting and gardening, for that matter, if you guys are gardeners, is never, ever, ever let a weed go to seed in your food plots or in your garden, because it just drops thousands of more seeds out into that space, which are then going to grow up. So if you guys don't want to use chemicals here, what you can do is just keep mowing and weed whacking and whatever every single thing that keeps coming up in your food plot so that they never go to seed. Now, that's not going to do anything about those native grasses. And like I said, if you guys want to plow to try to tear up the roots of those native grasses, all you're going to do is bring more noxious weed seeds to the surface. You're going to just keep doing this over and over and over again. And we're, of course, now no longer doing no-till. And you're going to be destroying the health of your soil because you're drying it out and you're just breaking up all of those microorganisms that are in the soil. So if you do want to spray, you're going to want to spray glyphosate at 2 quarts per acre. Spray one time, hopefully it kills everything, but keep an eye on it. If you need to reapply 2, 3, 4 weeks later, you can do that until everything's torched out of there. Again, we're not tilling, so underneath that soil is still going to be very, very healthy. You're just torching the surface of it to kill off those grasses. And actually, once you kill them, their roots will die and create more organic material in the soil, which will help your soil health too. Now, if you want to do this without chemicals, like I said, mow everything, keep everything mowed, and we're going to keep these weed-free through a crop rotation. I'll explain the planting times. So the times I'm going to use here are going to be for zone 5. If you guys are in zone 4, whatever dates I'm telling you, go a couple weeks earlier. If you guys are in zone 6, go a couple weeks later. If you guys are further down south, adjust these for your hunting season dates, because you guys aren't going to have the winter kill off that the rest of us in zone 6 on north are going to have. So you guys will probably have lush green food plots during the hunting season, where us in the north, we're just trying to have a lot of tonnage in the food plots that may have dried out by the time we get into later hunting seasons. But we're trying to get that growth early, get it established, and then have tonnage out there where you guys could have young, leafy green, still growing plants out there during your hunting season. That's, of course, what you're going to go for. While all those egg fields have old, mature growth in them, you want that young, tender, month, 2-month-old growth out there, and that's going to really help you guys down there in the farther south. Now, for zone 5, here are the dates. So mid-June, what you're going to want to do is plant buckwheat as a summer cover crop. So we plant buckwheat at 50 pounds per acre. Now what this is going to do is it's going to spring up, it's going to grow up, it's going to leaf out, and it is going to shade out all of your weeds that would ever try to grow in your food plot all summer long. This is a way that we keep the food plot weed free from the middle of June on. Now, I told you before that we can keep this going year round. So if this was an established food plot, last year we would have hopefully thrown down a cereal grain in it, preferably winter rye in these northern areas, but it can really be any cereal grain. And that's going to spring back up in the spring a couple of weeks before everything else does, and it's going to continue to choke out all of the weed seeds and everything that are out in your food plot. So in mid-June, what we're going to do is we're going to seed this buckwheat into that standing rye or whatever cereal grain. We're then going to crimp that rye or cereal grain to terminate it. This will be when it's in the dough stage, or not quite to the dough stage yet, so it will not have gone to seed, or the seed would not have hardened to become viable yet. So you're going to terminate it without having to introduce all of those seeds into your plot. We're going to plant that buckwheat, and then we're going to let that buckwheat grow for a couple months. Now, if you went and got that soil test, this is also when you want to introduce that fertilizer and that lime, dependent on what your soil test says. So it's a good time to get that out there, middle of June. There's not really anything else going on out in the deer woods, so good time to get out there and get that stuff established. So 2 months later, in the middle of August, this is when we're going to plant the actual food plot seed in your food plots that will be growing there during the hunting season. Now, it is very important that when you pick the time to plant this time of year, that you seed in front of a good rain. I have found myself waiting all of August some years to wait for that perfect rain to come, only to seed, and then it didn't actually come, and I get horrible germination in my plots. The plots end up not doing that great, and I end up having to save them with another technique that I'll teach you guys later in this video. So it is very, very important that you seed in front of a good rain so that you get good germination. Once the seeds germinate, they can deal with a little bit of drought, but ideally they'll still keep getting a steady rain every once in a while so they can continue to grow. But it's very, very imperative that you seed in front of that rain so that you get good germination. Now, the million-dollar question is, what do you plant in your food plots? Well, I'll tell you what I plant, and I'll tell you kind of an overall of what I recommend. I highly recommend diversity in your food plots, and the reason being is if you plant a monoculture in your food plot, meaning just one type of crop, what's going to happen is that crop's going to be very good and very attractive to the deer herd for a couple of weeks of the season, and then it won't be. So by planting a diverse food plot, you are going to have a different crop popping at any given time of the season. It might be the rye, it might be the brassicas, it might be the beans, it might be the peas. Whatever you guys are putting in there, make sure it is a mix of a bunch of different things so that you always have one specific thing that the herd is attracted to at that specific time of the season. Now, with that being said, don't just mix all your seeds together and throw them out there. There are so many different types of plants that cannot be planted with each other because one grows faster and thicker and lusher than the other one, and this one will just choke this one out and this one will never even get growing for you. When you guys go to the big box stores and you look at those food plot seed bags with the big buck on the front of them, you go and you look at the seeds on the back of them, you'll see things in there like sugar beets and a cereal grain. You would never plant those two things together. The cereal grain springs up so quick and so fast, and those sugar beets take forever to get established, that all those cereal grains are just going to choke out those sugar beets and they're never even going to get established. So for this, I will tell you exactly what I plant in my food plots and how I plant them. So I split all of my food plots in half. So even though they are L-shaped, I draw a line down the middle of that L, and I carry the two lines of the sides of the food plot all the way around the whole food plot. And on half of them is the easy thing. I plant a brassica blend. I haven't really discovered that any specific brassica blend is better than any other one. I've used several different ones. They all seem to work just great. Brassicas are also going to be your cheapest dollar per acre for food plots. So planting half of your food plot in brassicas is a good way to save money as well. Now the other half of the food plot, I plant a mix of peas, beans, and usually oats, but it can be any cereal grain. Oats are usually just the cheapest one for me to find because the oats are going to be planted only as a nurse crop to get those peas and beans established so the deer don't just nip them off the instant they pop out of the ground and then completely kill the plant on you. So on those sides, I plant that mix. Now I'm going to tell you guys a secret that none of the other big guys are talking about on how to get those peas and beans, those big seeds, to germinate. And the reason why they don't do this is because they pay people to come in and plant their food plots with seed drills, and you can't use this technique if you use a seed drill. But most of you are probably like me, where you're out there throwing seed down by hand or using a hand spreader or whatever, and this will work with that. So what I do with my beans and peas is I soak them in water before I plant them. So now they only need to soak for about 12 hours. Don't go crazy here. But what I do is I get these mesh bags, and I will leave a link to these down in the description so you guys can go check them out. But I put all of the seed into those mesh bags, tie a knot in the top of it so they don't come out, throw them into a 5-gallon bucket so that they can soak overnight. If they are seeds that float, just throw a rock into the bag with them. It'll sink them to the bottom. But soak your big seeds for about 12 hours before throwing them down. That's going to soften up the outside of that hardened shell, and you're going to be halfway to germination before you even get a rain. This is a way that I have definitely increased my germination with these big seeds. Guys, go and do this. It is worth the extra step to make sure you get that germination. Now let's talk about the seed rate. So brassicas, you're always going to want to plant at 6 to 7 pounds per acre. Do not overdo that. They are very tiny seeds, and you're going to feel like you're putting hardly anything out there. But once those grow up, they grow so big and so lush that if you overseed over 6 or 7 pounds per acre, they're not going to do as well. They're going to start pushing each other out, and you guys aren't going to have as good of a lush stand of brassicas out there. Now, on the other side with the peas, I plant 100 pounds per acre. Now, you can use Austrian winter peas here. You can use forage peas. You can use really any kind of pea, whatever you guys can get a hold of, whatever you can get your hands on here. But we're not trying to grow a crop, so those forage peas are going to work well for you. With the beans, I plant at 50 pounds per acre, so you can use Roundup Ready soybeans even if you never spray them with Roundup. That's just something that's readily available at pretty much every co-op. You can also use forage soybeans because, again, we're not trying to grow that bean head. We're not trying to harvest these. We're just trying to get that lush, leafy green growth for tonnage out there. And then you're going to want to seed that cereal grain, if it's oats or whatever, at about 30 to 40 pounds per acre. Again, that's a light seed for that, but that's just as a nurse crop so that something green pops up and the deer can nip on that instead of hopefully those beans and peas that are out there that take a little bit longer to get established. Now, if you didn't get your fertilizer and your lime down earlier in mid-June, you can throw it down now as well. Just make sure to get that out there and in the soil so that it's available for these crops to take up and use when they need it so that they can start getting their full growth potential as they start growing. Now let's fast forward one more month. So we get to the middle of September. So middle of September is actually going to be the early season of bow here in Wisconsin already. But what you want to do in the middle of September is go out, check out those food plots. They've had a month to grow at this point. If you have any food plot failures at this point, you can still save them. So at this point, you want to go, and any bare spots you have in your food plots, you want to throw down winter rye at 200 pounds per acre. This is going to spring something green up in those areas, and you're going to have a nice, lush food plot headed into the fall season, even if these other things failed on you. Now, the other thing I like to do is make sure I'm throwing down at least 50 pounds to 100 pounds per acre of winter rye, even in the other lusher areas of the food plot, so that I have winter rye coming up into the spring next season. That winter rye will also grow later into the season than the rest of the stuff we planted in the food plot. So in the cases where maybe the herd comes and browses you down early on in the season, that winter rye seed will be in there and we'll be able to come up and fix those areas of the plot that they browse down later beyond the middle of September. But I like to have at least the full food plot covered in 50 to 100 pounds of seed, those bare spots with 200 pounds per acre, so just double up in those areas. And then what that's going to create is a lush food plot for you guys to have during the hunting season, throughout the hunting season. It's going to help your deer herd get into winter with a full belly. So it's going to help your herd year after year doing this as well. And then what's going to happen in the spring, about 2 weeks before spring green up, that winter rye is going to pop up. Get your herd out of winter a couple weeks earlier too, again, to maintain those deer numbers so you don't have that death to exposure through the harsher winter months if you're further north. And then that winter rye is going to pop up. It's going to choke out all of those weed seeds. And then we start back over in mid-June with that buckwheat again. If you guys feel like you got some value out of this video, go ahead, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. If you enjoyed this video, YouTube thinks you're going to enjoy this one. Otherwise, go check out this one, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.